questions from time to time, sometimes debates, sometimes just inquiries, people genuinely curious about what it is our spiritual tradition is. Because we talk about how important it is for agriculture and our lives. We talk about our body modification in context to our spirituality. Everything's connected to our spirituality, but there's a lot of weird generalized ideas about spirituality, especially the stuff we're into. So we figured we'd take a few minutes and just kind of give a rough explanation of what we believe. It's not going to be complete because the subject's complicated, but so I'm trying to think of, I could do the whole where I tell you how I started, what I went through growing up, and how I got here, but I think that's a lot of information and it's for another time. Suffice to say that for both of us, spirituality and even religion played a massive role in our lives. It could have been from being exposed to different systems, being involved in, for me, cult behavior, being told you can't do things because of your gender, which my wife dealt with, and that's just kind of a general. So what is the term you use? I use heathen a lot, not quite accurate. Heathen just means people of the heather. So people who came from mountain environments where heather grows. It was a generalization. It's the same way that the word pagan means country folk. It doesn't really have anything to do with spirituality. Right out the gate, I could say that that's people define, as human beings do, defining other people as the other. You know, these are people who are country folk, i.e. maybe not as educated as us people in the city or in the, scholarly environments. Generally with that connotation, there's some sort of hokey suggestion there that they believe in weird superstitions.
And a lot of these ideas come from like Roman colonization. So keeping in mind, we talk about colonization in the United States and South America and Africa and India, but originally colonization started happening in Europe as Rome started taking it over. Slightly different, but not that much. But all these terms were used to put down the people that were being conquered, and to make them less than the Roman citizenry. So they're used in a different way now, but the origins of the word are not necessarily the most positive.
And to piggyback on what T just said, when people talk about, the European colonization of the West, and how colonialism takes over everything, these people who did that learned it from the Romans.
Right.
This is not, when people think like, oh, we did this to other people, yes, and the reason we did that is because it was done to us. We can see it amongst the Egyptian, in the Egyptian narrative. We can see it in the Sumerian narratives. Almost every part of the world at some point in time was taken over by another group who learned how to do this. And I don't think you double down and keep doing it as a way of fixing things. You stop doing it.
Yeah, pretty much.
So when we use terms like, I've had people say, well, why do you use the term heathen? It's a terrible word. I'm like, because if I say animist, it's not quite accurate, but it's...
And it's very confusing.
Very confusing. So I always start off with the idea that I am a Gnostic before I am anything else. And really simply, and this is going to frustrate people because there are actual groups that are Gnostics, and that's a religious sect, or is Gnosticism as a kind of philosophical way of viewing the universe. So I am a Gnostic in the sense that I believe that you're experiencing direct communication with the divine through your consciousness. I also believe in sort of a version of physics, like I would call it Gnostic physics, where I don't believe that I am a being with a soul. I believe I am the emanation of consciousness in the form that it needed to be, and that's what I am. It's not separate from my physical body. It is literally the underlying truth of all things, that I am what I am because that's what was appropriate and the energy was there, and so I manifested. You can see that in Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about when the cloud that you love dissipates and didn't go anywhere, it becomes rain, it becomes water. Sometimes that idea is of very little comfort to the Western mind because we're so possessed with the idea of self versus object. However, in indigenous cultures, that's not how people see things. T has been, reading about this and looking into this for years, and we both organically simply think about the world in the form of everything is consciousness and also has consciousness. Indigenous people think about things the same way we do, but it's not a common thought process in the West. So Western mind says, my consciousness, this is something over objects. Indigenous thought is all these things that occur naturally, organically, have their own consciousness. Or from a physics standpoint, I tell people that is the consciousness. So what is the consciousness of granite? Well, look at granite. You'll understand what its consciousness is. So people kind of overdo that. You see like my rock, you see the joke back in the 60s is the pet rock. Everybody had a pet rock. We don't think that rocks necessarily have human consciousness because they're not human, they're rocks.
Right, they have rock consciousness. And that's one of the things with animism is not humanizing other forms of or other peoples. So we're human people, there are rock people, there are different kinds of animal people, there are plant people, beings, whatever you want to use, whatever term you want to use, but they don't have human consciousness. They have their own consciousness.
It's become very common right now, and I actually think it's part of our brains waking up that we're forced to go to sleep for so long. This empathy that you see amongst different groups who maybe make dietary decisions based on whether or not they're eating other beings. I don't think they're necessarily wrong. What I think they're failing maybe to see, and this is a personal opinion, is that those beings' consciousness is not their consciousness. Mm-hmm. We put our own consciousness on other entities, and I think we do them a disservice because then we expect them to have a human perception of things when in fact they do not.
And I am going to specifically point out, if you don't eat animal beings because they're alive and have whatever emotions and feelings and whatever your reasoning for not eating them,
which is fine.
Which is fine,
yep.
But you have no problem eating plants who also have a consciousness and also have been proven to react to various interactions, as in you can talk and sing and interact with plants and it helps them grow better, and they move around, they communicate with each other, they have their own consciousness,
they perceive threats,
and not respecting that when you eat a plant you are also killing a being, because you don't eat animals because you're killing a being. You have to go, okay, this kind of being is higher level, so I don't want to kill that, but plants, whatever. You have to use your brain.
And it's about awareness,
And it's totally fine to not want to eat animals.
Exactly.
But you have to recognize that the choice that you're making is not conscious over unconscious, or spirit, soul over not a soul. It's this kind of being is not okay for me to eat, and this kind of being is okay for me to eat. That's my 2 cents.
Right. And in a spiritual path, we don't judge if somebody doesn't do certain things. That's their choice.
Right. Absolutely. Your body, your choice.
Your body, your choice is absolutely the case. There is, I could give you examples from the Celtic tradition of Talesin the Bard, who talks about emanating to Earth in the form of consciousness from sunlight, growing in the grass, dying as the grass when the herbivore eats it, dying as the herbivore when the predator eats it, dying, you know, as the animal eating that animal and becoming part of all consciousness, and then even going beyond that consciousness. And his whole point is that you never become less by dying, which is a lot closer to Eastern spirituality, I would think, than what we have in the West. It's tough to explain to people in the West what it is you're thinking when everything in the West is actually, and I'm not saying this disrespectfully, it's a little convoluted, because a lot of the systems we have in the West as far as spirituality claim monotheistic, but actually behave more like dualism. And this gets into very abstract subject matter. So in traditional Jewish mysticism, and I'll link into that because the Abrahamic faiths form the foundation of Western society. In mystic Judaism, suffering is separation or distance from God. Oh, there you go. There's a hawk.
Hi, friend.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That was good. So in that mystic Judaism, there is no hell is distance from consciousness, source, and God. Heaven is unification with source, and it's really just distance that makes it. So there's too much ignorance, or there's too much inert material between you and source, or there's too many low simplistic thoughts between you and higher thought consciousness. You can have your philosophical problems with that analogy, and either way, that's fine. But it's very different than what happens later, where you have more of the Paradise Lost, Milton, who's the other one? Dante,
The Inferno.
who is using kind of like Cathar dualism to describe Western monotheism. In other words, you have to have the devil in order to have God. But traditional Jewish mystics didn't think that way, and nor did your ancient Christians. Either way, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. It's just that it fractures consciousness. When you have to have other, this and that, then you fit into some weird third. You're fractured away from things. Indigenous peoples and polytheistic belief systems are not usually fractured from one source. They're all connected. It frustrates the Western mind because the Western mind works off of a thought process that I refer to generally as reductionism, and forms its basis out of agriculture. And the reductionist model is pretty straightforward, which is if something is wrong, remove it and fight it, and you'll get more of what you want. Whereas the traditional indigenous model is that more creates more. Those two systems cannot be more different. What we understand with agriculture is that reductionism is what caused the crushing, debilitating removal of soil that turned the Fertile Crescent into desertification. And that the way you fix this through the savory style model of rotational grazing or different models of permaculture is that you invest more into the biosphere and you get more back. And reductionism doesn't create more. Reductionism always creates a reduction, hence what it is. This isn't just true of agriculture, in our opinion. It is true of thought, spirituality, approaches to financial systems, where people have to divide up and control versus working with the harmony of nature and growing abundance. And so it's hard to explain to a Western mind when you talk about a spiritual system that involves something polytheistic. The Western mind immediately is always trying to reduce it to which one's the good, which one's the evil.
Or like male and female.
Male
like
and female.
All the gods are the same, all the goddesses are the same. You just have to, it doesn't know.
And then they argue over that
Yeah.
stuff. That's a reductionist philosophy. So one of the reasons we figured, especially today bringing it up, is that there's been recently a few times where one of us or both of us have been engaged with discussions with people about spirituality. And it's understandable that in a reductionist philosophical mindset like we have in the West, that people want you to distill down experience so that they can process it easier. However, when it comes to systems that are all-inclusive, distilling something down into the cliff notes means reductionism. It means removing things. And our opinion mostly is that while we don't mind talking about spirituality, it's really something you live. It's not really something you talk about. We talk about it in order to share an understanding that we've come to for others who are trying to get onto the path and aren't sure where to go. But just because we're saying it doesn't mean it's absolute by any stretch.
Right. Because realistically, every human upon the earth has their own approach. Our minds work differently. Our consciousness and connection to the source is specific and is not like our experience will never be able to convey completely to another human in words. Even Jay and I have similar ideas about the world, but they certainly aren't the same.
Right.
Like we agree on many things, but we have different approaches to the same ideas often. So it does make it difficult to discuss exactly what our spirituality looks like. I had someone ask me recently what, I forget how it was phrased, but essentially what my spiritual practice looked like on a day-to-day basis, which is kind of a crazy thing to ask, because that's kind of like, other than being very personal.
It's a wildly personal question.
It also, like, how do you speak to the prayers that are in your head every time you have an interaction with another being, or the thoughts that are in your mind while you're daydreaming that relate to your goals and dreams for your life, which come back to your spiritual belief system. How do you talk about your ancestors and the seed of their experience that exists within you that you haven't even discovered yet, but you feel?
Right.
So there's so much more to a spiritual practice than can be possibly conveyed.
And what we see in the West is a lot of times people are like, so I just do this prayer, I set up this altar, and like for somebody like one of us who is every moment of every day constantly is living the spiritual path. It's not, now it's prayer time. No, prayer is your life. Your prayer is your great work of your life. Your prayer is every interaction, every thought, everything. It's not in an altar. It's not in putting some weird face paint on or dancing naked around the moon or whatever it is that people are.
And all of
those things are fine.
Things are valid expressions, and we also engage in spiritual practices that are more ritualized, ritualistic, ceremonial. But those things are not necessary. Those things are the triggers that remind you that you're a spiritual being, that remind you that life is more than your coffee in the morning and your drive to work and your drive home.
Right. You're celebrating when you're having a big ritual, you're almost celebrating your spiritual tradition. But it's the difference between, like, the way I'd put it for the Western mind is, there are some people who go to church on Christmas Eve and that's the only time they go to church. There are some people who go to church every day of the week. And then there are those people who maybe they go to church, maybe they never go to church. But you meet them and you go, this person's not having an occasional conversation with the divine. They're having a constant conversation with the divine. Every act is a conversation with the divine. Everything is relevant and sacred. Right, there you go. Now you're into it. And so, without dragging this on endlessly, when it comes to a spiritual tradition, especially when it comes to the heathen, Celtic, pagan tradition, because I can't speak for anybody else's traditions, but those are my background. No one has the authority to tell you what is the practice and what is not the practice. Realistically, there is no symbol that we know of that we can prove beyond a shadow of doubt is the original true communication. We don't have that. No one does. The same way that the cross is not originally the symbol of that faith, neither is one particular god the symbol or the practice of that god or the symbol of that god the absolute illustration of that faith. You know, the Volt Nut in heathenism may not be that old. It may not be a true representation of whatever true representation of the ancient practices, because the reality is none of us know what that was.
Right.
None of us.
Right.
And when someone chimes in and says, well, you can't have that, okay, so we're going to do reductionism again. So we're going to start taking away the things that don't apply. Well, guess what? If you're one of those elitists, and we've run into these people who are like, you must be Norwegian or Scandinavian, you must be of this blood type, only these are the people. Those people, I'd like to point out, didn't think historically from time to time that, let's say, the Irish were equal to them. They were below them in station, and yet without the Irish and their writing, there would be no Norse sagas. That is a fact. That is not even a question.
And so many of those cultures are interwoven.
They borrow.
So many of, especially in Europe, because train travel is significantly easier in such a large continent. Like, many people moved from one area to another area. There were not borders the way we have borders now. You know, the Gauls were like France and up towards Scandinavia and went into the islands, and the culture changed as it moved. So there is no such thing as static culture at any point in time, and every area had its own interpretation. Every area had its own Thor like god, or its own Liu, or its own Caradwen. You know, there's every iconic god, goddess, mythological entity is heavily influenced by many, many, many things. So nothing became or came into culture in like a sterile environment.
Right. And this idea that this is the only way that we pray, or this is all allegory, or these are just archetypes, or these are literal. Like, people go, which one is it? I can't tell you that. I have no way of explaining that one to you. That's up to you.
Yeah.
No one else has the right. But there's a lot of times, and getting to this point here, is that if someone tells you that you have no place in the system because your ethnicity, or your sexuality, or your gender, or your interpretation of it, feel free to laugh at those people and just go right back to whatever it is you were doing.
Right.
Because no one has the authority to define for anyone else what their conversation is with the divine. That is personal. That is only for them. So when I tell you that for me, I believe this act to have spiritual significance, I at no point in time am saying that this must be true for you.
Right.
It is only true for me. And if it is true for you in the same sense that you get that from it, not that it has truth based on my perception, but that it has relevance to me based on my experience, if that is the case for you, great. If that's not the case for you, great. It's as simple as when Americans or Europeans or Westerners tried to define the traditions of Hinduism and the perceptions of those traditions. They fall so brutally short. And if you ask someone who grew up in the Hindu tradition, it's frustrating for them a lot of times to try to explain to the Western mind what it is they're talking about. As you enter into this tradition, you're tearing down the structures of rigid reductionist thought in the Western mind. You must be open to the idea that, hey, you like this, that doesn't prove anything. That's just for you. And like T said, you have these comparisons, I'm not, I got a small percentage of Armenian in me. I love the Armenian idea of Christ. This character that is associated with thunderstorms. Wherever he strikes the ground with his hammer, a church rises. He is there to protect his brethren. Have you ever heard of a more Thor type character? Why does it have to be one or the other? If you're a polytheist, it doesn't. I can pray to Jesus, and it's not the Jesus that you're thinking of, but it's still, for me, relevant. And I can also pray to Odin, and I can also pray to Lu. And when someone comes in and says, you can't do that in this tradition, remember, at no point in time is this set in stone.
Right.
Ever.
And realistically, because the only real written records that we have of our ancient traditions, especially in European-based traditions, are written by Christian colonizers centuries after the fact. And we had pretty much only oral traditions that were passed down generation to generation through, fireside tales that talk of gods and the supernatural, and are also lessons in how to live your life. The only recordings of those are highly Christianized, so we can't even necessarily trust that information is entirely accurate. And it doesn't really matter. It's not a terrible place to start, but a lot of your practice is going to come from your experience, your perception of the universe, your history, your ancestors. And I don't mean ancestors just by bloodline, but also by faith and life experience. You create your own spiritual practice, and looking at what other people do is good when you're looking for where to start building your ideas. Mostly it's important to just listen to your intuition, your inner voice, your higher self, whatever you want to call it, but that is the only voice that can tell you what is your spiritual practice.
That is absolutely it. That's absolutely it. We could keep reiterating this over and over again. There's so many points to it that you can hammer into, but when T said that it's part of that, people absorbing traditions, people usurping traditions. One other thing I would add to this is that in the West, one of the things that was done to us as children was that we were all taught that the telephone game was an inaccurate way of passing information down. It is interesting to me that there's so much of a bias against memorization, when in all indigenous cultures, memorization was considered as a great skill and something worth passing along. They passed on truth in weird narratives, tales that later on become reality, but weren't necessarily reality for the people telling them. One example of this is, I like to point out, is like the Brown laws in Ireland. If you want to become a lawyer in Ireland, you have to memorize the Brown laws. And the Brown laws are a complicated system of laws. They're some of the oldest laws in the world. And in order to adjudicate or be a bard in ancient Ireland, you had to know these off the top of your head. They was required. And I'm not talking like it's 10 laws. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of written pages of stuff. And this would be checked again and again. You'd learn this with one spiritual teacher, mouth to ear, and you would repeat it back to each other constantly. And it would be tested again and again. This is done in certain places in the world. It is done among the Latvians in their tradition, where they have, and I'm going to draw a blank on this, I'll put a word underneath as to what this is, the Kalevala. Literally pages and pages and pages of complex story that must be repeated back and forth perfectly. when people tell you can't do this, people do this. The people of the rainforest know 5,000 different birds by their calls. They're not stupid people. Just because they don't read about it in a book does not mean that their information is invalid or it's flawed or it's fractured. They work diligently and live in that environment with these things. You in the West are fractured and separated from your traditions, and then you're piecemeal giving it back a little bit at a time. You have to take your own power back and make it part of your own life and immerse yourself in it if you're going to do this as a traditional practice. And you need to forgive yourself when you think you fall short of it, because you're not learning it from the ground up, you're reinventing it from one mindset to another, if that makes sense. You're doing a sort of reintroduction of all things to a brain that has based everything off of reductionism. It's not going to be easy. Don't kick yourself over it. And all parts of your background are relevant. That's the last thing I'm going to say about this. It's not, oh, I am 30% Native American, so that's my spiritual practice. You're 30% Native American. You're 70% something else. Like, all of those things that make up your genetics are your ancestors. All of those traditions connect to you, whether or not you like it. And if you're doing ancestor work, you're healing things. If you're doing work with one set of gods and not another, you might need to look into both parts or all parts. We are a complete being. Have I covered it all?
I think so.
Thanks for listening. I figure we're just going to probably put this up unedited as it is. Yeah, there we go. Except for the part in the beginning where I have allergies and I'm sneezing.